Today we will be presenting our research on the topic Equator Principles, how Uzbek banks can adopt EP and become a member. As you can see on our agenda, we are going to speak about what the Equator Principles are, their main ideas, and the scope of their approach. We will point out the benefits of adopting the Equator Principles and furthermore, compare the ideas of the principles to the legislation of Uzbekistan. And finally, consider the implementation of these principles to Uzbek banks. What are the Equator Principles? The Equator Principles were first established in 2003 after a group of 10 international banks, led by the International Finance Corporation, came together to develop a set of voluntary guidelines for managing environmental and social risks associated with project financing. The banks were responding to growing concerns among investors, civil society, and other stakeholders about the negative impacts of large-scale projects such as oil and gas pipelines, dams, and mining operations on local communities and the environment. The Equator Principles comply with the IFC performance standards on environmental and social sustainability and the World Bank Group Environmental, Health and Safety Guidelines, and are formed by 10 principles. We will make a general description of each principle, but we highly recommend you to read the original EP4 guidelines available on the official website. The first principle, review and categorization, involves dividing the projects based on the possible impact on environment and society into categories A, B, or C, where A implies projects with significant adverse impact and C minimum or no impact. The second principle is about conducting an environmental and social assessment, where the client is required to evaluate environmental and social risks, make an assessment of baseline conditions, and to conduct an alternatives analysis, which involves methods for mitigating project-related greenhouse gas emission. The third principle is about determining applicable environmental and social standards. This principle implies compliance with host country standards and/or IFC and World Bank guidelines. The fourth principle is on environmental and social management system and Equator Principles action plan. It mainly involves the development of appropriate documents and policies which would correspond to the Equator Principles. Principle 5 on stockholder engagement implies that the client should disclose project-related information and the environmental and social assessment document to affected communities, workers, and other stakeholders, as well as be open for negotiation. This principle also includes the impact on indigenous people. Principle 6 on the grievance mechanism involves actions and procedures for considering stakeholders' concerns on environmental and social impact which may arise during the consulting and participation processes. The Principle 8 is on the independent review, where reasons for deviations from the Equator Principles and actions to avoid them are indicated. Principle 8 on covenants is about making agreements to comply with relevant requirements implied with the membership in the Equator Principles Association. Principle 9, independent monitoring and reporting, states that there is a need for an independent environmental and social consultant provided by the bank to monitor and report on the projects accepted. And the last principle on reporting and transparency is about that the client is obliged to report on environmental and social impact assessment, greenhouse gas emission level, and project-specific biodiversity data on an ongoing basis.
Scope of the Equator Principles. The Equator principles can be applied when offering the following to project finance related financial products. Project finance with total project capital costs of 10 million US dollars or more. Another one, project related corporate loans where all of the following three criteria are met. First one, the maturity of the loan is related to a project over which the client has effective operational control, either direct or indirect, like impact on performance of the project. The second one, the total aggregate loan amount and the EPFI's individual commitment before syndication or sell down are each at least 50 million US dollars. The third one, the loan tenor is at least 2 years. Bridge loans with a tenor of less than 2 years that are intended to be refinanced by project finance or a project-related corporate loan. Bridge financing is a form of temporary financing intended to cover a company's short-term costs until the moment when regular long-term financing arises. Another project finance related financial products is project related refinance and project related acquisition finance, where all of the following three criteria are met. First one, the underlying project was financed under the Equator Principles framework. Second one, there has been no material change in the scale or scope of the project. And the last one, project completion has not yet occurred at the time of the signing of the facility or loan agreement. European experience. The Equator Principles has helped these banks to manage risks, engage with their clients, and demonstrate their commitment to sustainability. First, Equator Principles help significantly to increase the reputation of the banks. The adoption of the Equator Principles enables member banks to establish themselves as responsible financial institutions that take environmental and social risks seriously. The principles require banks to assess and manage the social and environmental risks of project financing, which are often significant. Equator principles are recognized as the global standard for responsible banking, and the adoption of these principles helps banks improve their image with stakeholders, including customers, investors, and regulators. By adopting these principles, the banks demonstrate their commitment to sustainable finance and distinguish themselves from competitors that do not follow the same standards. To attract these investors and gain access to a larger pool of capital and new business opportunities. Second, compliance with the Equator principles allows for reaching a wider pool of investors who are increasingly concerned about environmental and social risks. Many institutional investors have their own social and environmental policies that require them to invest only in companies that meet certain standards. By adhering to the Equator principles, the banks are able to attract these investors and gain access to a larger pool of capital and new business opportunities. The next one, the Equator principles help banks to avoid reputational risks associated with controversial projects. The principles require banks to assess the social and environmental risks of the projects they finance and take appropriate measures to mitigate those risks. By following these guidelines, a member bank is able to avoid funding projects that could harm the environment or local communities, which could lead to negative publicity and reputational damage, legal liability, and financial loss. The next one, adherence to the Equator principles helps the banks better manage the risks associated with project finance. The principles require banks to conduct due diligence of the projects they finance, assess potential social and environmental risks and develop strategies to mitigate those risks. By following these recommendations, the banks will be able to identify potential risks at an early stage and take appropriate action to manage them, reducing the likelihood of costly lawsuits or project failure. These benefits have helped the banks build a more sustainable business and contribute to achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Comparison of Uzbek legislation to the Equator Principle. Equator principles have been adopted by over 100 banks and financial institutions worldwide. Uzbekistan is a dynamically developing country with a growing economy. In recent years, the country has made significant progress in attracting foreign investment, especially in the energy and infrastructure sectors. Uzbekistan joined the UN Paris Climate Agreement in April 2017, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992, the Vienna Convention on the Project of the Ozone Layer in 1993, and other important international agreements. However, there are still significant environmental and social risks associated with financing projects in Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan has enacted several laws associated with ecological and environmental issues. In this comparison, we will examine the relevant Uzbek laws and compare them to the requirements of the Equator Principle. According to Article 30 of the Constitution of the Republic of Uzbekistan, all state bodies, public associations, and officials of the Republic of Uzbekistan are obliged to provide citizens with the opportunity to familiarize themselves with documents, decisions, and other materials affecting their rights and interests, which is similar to Principle 5 on stakeholder engagement regarding disclosure assessment documents on environmental or social risks and adverse impacts that may influence affected communities, workers, and other stakeholders. The Law on Environmental Protection. According to Chapter 6 of the Law on Environmental Protection, implementation of a project with no positive conclusion of the state ecological expertise conducted is prohibited. This law corresponds with Principle 3 on applicable environmental and social standards regarding compliance with the host country legislation, particularly the separate law on ecological expertise meets to some extent Principle 2 on the Equator Principle on environmental and social assessment. The law on water and water usage. Enterprises, organizations, and institutions whose activities affect the state of waters and water bodies are obliged to carry out technological, forest reclamation, agrotechnical, hydrotechnical, sanitary, and technical measures agreed with the authorities for ecology and environmental protection, water management, sanitary supervision, and other interested authorities. The Law on Protection of Atmospheric Air and Article 861 of the Criminal Code of Uzbekistan mentioned the need for enterprises, institutions, and organizations to regulate the use of ozone-depleting substances, equipment, and technical devices containing ozone-depleting substances, as well as to keep records of ozone-depleting substances, considering their replacement with ozone-friendly substances. This article is similar to the request of the Equator Principle in Annex A on climate change, where alternatives analysis, quantification, and reporting of greenhouse gas emission are required. According to the Equator Principle Association Governance Rules, Section 5 on the adoption of the principles, any financial institution is free to implement Equator principles. as long as it meets the adoption requirements and promises to fulfill the ongoing reporting requirements. A bank applying for Equator Principles membership have to examine and understand the Equator Principles requirements, develop an internal policy compliant with Equator Principles, signing of an agreement involving the conduction of information disclosure. Should Equator Principles be adopted in Uzbek banks? Uzbekistan should adopt the Equator Principles to promote sustainable development, protect the environment and human rights, attract investment, and promote social equity and inclusivity. Conclusion: the adoption of the principles would require the establishment of a national framework for environmental and social risk management, the adoption of the principles as part of financial institutions' risk management practices, and the engagement with international stakeholders to promote their adoption. By taking these steps, Uzbekistan can become a leader in environmental and social risk management in the region while also attracting investment and promoting sustainable development.